Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Essence Podcast, Into the Woods, in which I hesitantly sometimes venture into the woods to speak with fellow witches, spiritual practitioners, and all sorts of interesting people, and the occasional bear, which is always good. Today, I have somebody I've been really looking forward to and nervously interested in having on the podcast. I have Lee Morgan. Hello, Lee.
Hi, how are you?
I'm amazing. I'm really good. How are you?
Yeah, I'm not too bad, thank you. It's,
Yeah.
you know, it's a work in progress some days, but today is a decent day.
I feel that on a deep soul level. For those who, I think you're a regular name in the traditional witchcraft community. For those who are kind of in the other areas of the pagan sphere and who may not know you, Lee Morgan is, where's your little bio I have here? So Lee Morgan is a dual British and Australian author, scholar, and traditional witch, residing on a communal homestead on Kunanyi, otherwise known as Mount Wellington, in Nipaluna, otherwise known as Hobart, Tasmania, where he creates sanctuary for other weirdos, raises books, people, and ideas from the grave. He has had novels and non-fiction published by Moon Books, Freehands Press, The Witch's Almanac, and Rebel Satori Press. Traditional witchcraft and the faerie faith have occupied Lee's attention from an early age, and he has held office in his magical community for 2 decades. Scholarship and creative fiction continue to allow him to speak, in some suggestive ways, of things that cannot otherwise be spoken. Having survived an enormous tumour, Lee currently is busy filling the room in his skull with new brains, writing folk horror and queering the world one step at a time. His latest book is People of the Outside, which I was very honored to blurb and read before it came out, and is currently available from Moon Books. He's also the author of A Deed Without a Name, Standing and Not Falling, and The Gusty Deep, among others. You can find him on social media and Patreon, and all of those links are at www.leemorganbooks.com, and I will, of course, put those in the show notes. Lee, welcome again.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So, Lee, to start our conversation today, I was going to start with sense of place, but well, actually, I will start with that today. So we were chatting last night before meeting today, and you were telling me a little bit about kind of the back and forth between the two countries, England and Australia. And I'm curious about your journey to Kunanyi and to Nipaluna in general. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. It was a very visionary thing. I didn't actually intend to settle here, really. We were looking for somewhere for a job for my partner, and he was interested in Steiner education, and there was a Steiner school down here. So it was on a
Mm.
large list, including Canada and all sorts of other places that had cold weather. Um, and I I suppose I was just seeking the right place because I did also look at places in Britain as well. Being a citizen, it seemed easy as a option for us.
Mm.
But yeah, I had a very strong vision of a mountain that was capped in snow and it was overlooking a very small town near the ocean. And I couldn't actually work out, terribly ignorant of Tasmania, to be honest with you, despite having lived in Australia for quite some time. I didn't realize
Mm.
that Tasmania had that until we were looking at the particular school, and I spotted kunanyi, and I thought that's it. And to be honest, I don't quite understand why. Like,
Mm.
there's a question mark over it for me, like why this is where we seem to have ended up. But then I guess we couldn't have done what we've done anywhere else. Like we have 6 acres
Mm.
of forest, like um, what you would call temperate rainforest, backing onto a wilderness preserve, which
Wow.
is a drive from Hobart. So you wouldn't, I suppose, set up a group like we've been able to do if you tried to do that in Britain. Unfortunately, I think you'd have to be the Queen to
Yeah.
own something like that in England.
Pretty much.
Mm.
Pretty much. Wow. What was the turning point for you? What was the moment of you recognizing, okay, this is it?
Oof, that's a difficult question. I
I
suppose,
know.
I mean, we came here without ever having, or I hadn't actually seen the place before. I just did it, but I didn't think it was forever.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but it became forever, at least as far as I can understand. It seems to be forever. We've started an intentional community here
Mm,
and quite committed to the location. Yeah, I couldn't say that there was a single moment, but there has been a dawning realization that something in the darkness of the history that this place holds is important.
mm,
It's highly fertile darkness that's led me through a great creative process, particularly with my fiction. And it's that sort of discomfort which is productive. It's
yeah.
an itch or an irritation, I suppose, that's buried in the memory of the place, and I'm not done with it, and I don't know how long I'll be dealing with it. So I think
Mm,
that's the best answer I can give you on that topic.
yeah. Of course, that generates like a million other questions, but I guess the one most pressing is that in relationship with that itch, with that relationship with that darkness, is it just in your fiction that that comes out, or where can we see that in your nonfiction work, if it appears?
Um, I've always felt my non-fiction work was a little bit more divorced from my emotional center, I might say,
Um,
until my most recent non-fiction book, which I do feel came out of the darkness I was passing through in my own experiences a lot more, and I think was touched a little bit more by the spirit of place. I think I think one of the reasons my fiction has always appealed to me more is I felt more free to
mm,
talk about whatever I wanted to in fiction, whereas with non-fiction, I was trying to keep, I suppose, a couple of walls between myself and my audience. Yes, and then that book I began writing in the last few months before they found my tumour, and
mm,
finished writing it afterwards. And it was there's definitely something of this place in that book, but I
mm,
couldn't exactly explain to you what. It definitely has part of this place in it, but it also comes from everything that I've passed through, and it's my black work. I mean, as you
yeah.
could probably tell by the topic, it's yeah, it's it's not as lighthearted or practical, I suppose, as some of the others.
Hmm. I suppose in some ways it depends on like picking up that piece around if it's as practical. I suppose it's finding where people are at, right? One person's practicality is another person's kind of 101, right? Or and so on and so
Exactly.
on. Yeah.
And I think I also wanted to prove that I could still write like that with references and everything after being threatened with the loss of my intellect. I had a very strong sense that I wanted to show I could still do that kind of work, and that I wasn't afraid of shocking people at all
Mm-hmm.
with the
Yeah.
material.
The book, well, maybe this is a good place to dive into that now. Tell us a little bit about the book. I've
Yeah.
obviously read it and it's available, but tell us a little bit about it.
Um, well, it's available for pre-order and through
Oh,
author
that's right,
copies that I
right.
can get. It's actually technically not published yet, so there's a bit of a wait on it.
Mm,
Um, but yeah, I think I've been chewing on that topic for quite some time. Like, I've always been very interested in paleoanthropology and things of that nature, and very interested in the non-human
mm,
element of things, the concept that perhaps even genetically that there is something that's not human mingled in our DNA. And
mm,
I've been watching the process of people unpacking the whole Neanderthal story for a couple of decades, and it's really been of interest to me at a very primal level, where I've always felt that there was some kind of connection between the appearance of the face of earlier people and the way that witches are depicted as having this
Mm.
nose and these protruding teeth and brow and everything. And yeah, I don't know how it ended up mingled in with cannibalism, but I think it was just, yeah, I've been following it, and that a lot of the things in there, the scientific stuff that I've drawn on, are quite recent things, which I think
Mm.
more and more illustrate notions of and it's not that I'm suggesting that witchcraft actually dates back somehow that far. It's more of a haunting. It's more of a sense that there is something quite ancient that keeps reverberating through witchcraft, whether we
Yeah.
even understand it or not. I think there is something of a forbidden practice that could have something to do with an older history. And I guess
Yeah.
that's what that book is about. And it's also about taboos. It's also like we all talk about
Mm.
taboo violation in witchcraft all the time, but that book actually hits a couple of key taboos that make people very
Mm.
uncomfortable. And I think that's actually quite important because a lot of those things are things that witches have been accused of in the past. And I think we need to
Yes.
grapple with that, not just because we may or may not violate those taboos, but because we have been accused of it, and it's part of the story of witchcraft. And I guess that's why I wanted to grapple with it despite the discomfort.
Yeah, yeah, it's stepping into that discomfort, right? It isn't just showing it. What I got from reading it, and it was beautifully written, by the way. There was really
Thank
that
you.
that continuation from your other books and the style of those other books. You're not just giving us the Paleolithic data. You're not just giving us the cross cultural data. You're inviting us into a story. It almost felt like Memnoch leading Lestat around the world, showing him
Mm,
the world, right? I don't know. I don't know if that's a true alliteration there, but that's what it reminded me of.
very much so. And I think the Anne Rice reference is quite telling because
Yeah.
she was one of my key influences as an early teenager that I began to read her, and the suggestion she always plays along the edges of whether or not her characters are real.
Hmm.
That notion, that she talks about the start sometimes as if he were a real individual.
Hmm.
And that imaginative concept, I think, has leached its way through all of my work, both fiction and nonfiction. So I quite
Absolutely.
appreciate that reference.
Absolutely,
Really.
absolutely. It's,
Mm,
but I think that speaks to that liminality that you were speaking of in so many of your pieces, and specifically that connection of which, when we look at so many people who are taking on that identity and taking on that word for themselves, they're all marginalized people. It's a marginalized community now, as opposed to that of the elite, right?
mm.
Mm.
It's an interesting thought because one wonders if we were always as marginalized as a way of knowing, because literature on witches only comes about post persecution. And I think you do see people from all groups who were
Mm.
targeted in the past, but they always have some marginal aspect about them, even if they are, members of sort of particular genders or sexualities, or even if they're wealthy. There was occasionally people persecuted that were, sorry, um, quite well off, but they might
Yeah.
have been marginal in some other way. And
Yes.
I think that's what's quite interesting is that we are marginal, but we don't necessarily belong to all marginal categories. Um, but it is part of the legacy, whether or not it was originally. I mean, it obviously goes back a fair way, that notion of it as a banned practice, um, as far
Absolutely.
as we can trace it, for sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But there's empowerment in that, in stepping into those banned practices. Would you say that I mean, I know you said you're not hoping people take away, Victory should go and practice cannibalism, but do you think that there's a sense of power in exploring, even mentally, that the taboos?
Definitely. Yeah, I think
Mm,
so, because I think as a witch, we're interested in what you might call the fruit on the tree of knowledge, aren't we? Like we want to know
mm,
things that we may not be blessed to know easily. We have to often struggle for them. And so I think there's a lot of questions that are worth asking around things like that. Um, you know, we are an animal like other animals, and it's something that our ancestors seem to have done a great deal of in the past, as far as what science can tell us about human ancient
mm.
paleo history, that cannibalism had a part in the making of our species. And I think a lot of witchcraft is like cannibalism, even if it's not actual cannibalism, the process of hacking somebody or taking life force from something else, whether it be crops, whether it be people. These practices are sort of a form of cannibalism.
A few moments later.
Okay, so for those who are listening, we actually just turned our cameras off because Lee's or my bandwidth is not doing great. So from here on out, we are going to be stepping into the dark and we're going to be listening with our other senses and experiencing with our other senses. So Lee, I apologize. You were cut off. You were just saying that sense of energy and that sense of life force in other ways. Can you finish your
Yes.
thought there?
Yeah. I was just trying to say that I think the things that we've been associated with, and I think also the things that many of us do, even if we don't want to do them, that tip us off to the idea that we might be witches, have to
Mm,
do with taking energy, power, life force from
mm,
other things. And that sounds very bad. It doesn't sound like a positive thing that people want to be engaged with. But then you remember that anything that you eat, whether it be
mhm,
vegetable or animal, is a life force. And we're always consuming something to continue to live. The whole of the world is. And I
mm.
guess what people don't like about witches is the idea that they might not know that that person does that thing. It might sort of
Yeah.
trigger a kind of paranoid response, which can lead to the persecution of people that are different, which brings us back around to that marginality concept again.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's that false sense. It's that false sense of control. And you've written about this. Many of our colleagues have written about this as well. That sense of death, of exuberant sexuality, of freedom, in many ways, is that lack of control, right?
Exactly. And I
Mm,
think that's why it's quite interesting to ask questions about taboo violation, because
mm,
it suggests that those of us who are living on the margins are able to ask questions that are not open to other people to ask necessarily, that we don't have to worry about whether or not that makes us popular,
mm.
because most witches are never going to be particularly popular with the world outside of witchcraft. It allows the kind of freedom to ask questions and to experience also, I think, the stimulation of the discomfort. Because it's
Mm,
not like I don't experience discomfort when I talk about some of those things that are discussed in my book. There are some of them that are quite intense, people eating babies, the discussion about Black Tantra and the eating of
mhm,
feces and all kinds of like really intense stuff that makes you go, oh, but
mm.
it's sort of an exploration of that feeling of discomfort and kind of leaning into that and going, okay, let's have a really close look at the nature of death and the human body and that gross out response. What is that? Where's that coming from? And I think, in some cases, there's a really good explanation that the thing may indeed not be physically healthy for you to do, but it's interesting. And I think, there's some spiritual traditions that believe that leaning into that discomfort is a form of meditative practice, which unites you with the all.
Very much so, very much so. The ones I am intimately connected with, absolutely. That sense of deprivation, that sense of stepping into that is definitely a form of meditation that you're prepared for often, right?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. You're guided into that in many ways. I mean, the image of the witch, and especially the image of the witch that comes through in your work, is that as guide, as gateway. And you make that point again and again in your newest, is that it is an invitation, right?
Very much so. And I continue to feel that some of this material, not just coming from me, but coming from a lot of us right now, is relevant to people other than witches, in terms of the fact that a lot of that stigma has disappeared. I mean, it hasn't disappeared. We all know that there's evangelicals who would like to see us all burn in hell. But in general, society doesn't persecute us the way that it used to. I think it's a wonderful opportunity for us to consider this marginal status, this sort of taboo violating thing, because it's giving us a chance to look at some of the things that have been nurtured in the shadows, where people have gone off to the side, and some of them may have done so because of their gender or their sexuality, or they may be neuroatypical or diverse. Sorry, there are different reasons for that. We didn't have the words for that in the past, but now that we do, there's this exciting opportunity to consider the underside of Western culture, which has been stuck underneath this, this sense of taboo.
I love that I'm having this conversation with somebody from back home, from the UK originally, because, I mean, you know how devastatingly averse British culture is to anything taboos, to the extent of, well, what would the neighbor think if you're wearing pink versus blue, or all of this crap, right? I'm curious with your background, particularly with community building, because so much of your, at least the work that I'm aware of, is around that building of community. In your bio, you've built a communal homestead, and you recently had a class. I mean, we're recording this in early October, mid-October, and you recently had a full class on those facilitation skills. Can you tell us then about that place for you of being that guide, the responsibilities, and what you've learned about taking on that role?
Absolutely. I think that the two things link together, actually, because I think if you find that you're slightly marginalized in some way, you tend to try to find a tribe or a clan or someone to hold on to, because you may not have that in your blood family. I, in some ways, did, and in some ways didn't. And I think the same is the case for a lot of the other people that I make community with. We are people that are the odd one out in some way in our blood family. One of the things that I really talked about a lot, and I'm very happy with my first in-person workshops, I might just throw on in there as
Oh,
well.
that's right, it was, yes.
So yeah, it was such a relief though to know that I can still do this kind of thing. But yeah, I look a lot at, because what I've noticed over this large period of time that I've been working on this topic, one topic, it's not really a topic, bringing people together. I noticed that people start off with different biases, different sort of lanes in their character, and some people have a great deal of what I would class as that sort of black spirit, black serpent power around them. Other people are tipped in a different direction, such as the green or the red. And that I found over time, that sort of, well, I use the term alchemy quite a bit because those colors also appear in alchemy. That notion of a blackening phase and a whitening phase, and inevitably a reddening phase. I find that there is a kind of alchemy that emerges in coven life if you are deeply dedicated to that with those people, that over time people kind of wear away at each other. The people that come in that might have a lean in one direction, they spend some time around people that are quite different to themselves, and usually they irritate each other. That's why I draw on the pearl and the oyster imagery, because pearls are formed through that grit in the oyster that irritates the oyster. And I try to sort of prepare people for that idea in a coven, that at some point or another, the differences in your coven mates is going to annoy the crap out of you. You're going to, find it challenging. But if both of you want to be family, and ultimately that is what I do, is, I sort of adopt people, I suppose, is the best analogy that you could give for bringing someone into your witch house, is that they become siblings over time, sometimes outdoing your blood siblings in terms of their dedication to you. And it's a wonderful journey, but there is a great deal of irritation that happens. But over time, I don't know, that gets replaced by something else. I think it gets replaced by a sort of shy interest that begins to build up between you and people whose sorcerer speciality may be the opposite. Like if you think just about red and black, the person who has a natural inclination towards black sorcery can be quite challenging for someone who is more red. And I would say, in a nutshell, you could say that your black realm person is very attuned to the dead and working with the dead and necromancy, whereas your red realm person is more of an animal whisperer and a cook and a person of great charisma. And so often those two, just as a case in point, trigger each other. Like the red realm person finds the black realm person too reactive, too defensive, too, territorial. And, the black realm person's irritated by the lack of attention and the lack of loyalty and the lack of all of those things that mark out their wondrousness. And I love all of them, actually, and consider that to be an important thing with a coven, is having somebody who is into all of those specialities, guiding that.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. What responsibility? Is that even the word I want to use? What is the role then for you as coven leader, as head of that group, as facilitator of that group? What is the role that you think people should have going into a role like that? I think maybe that's the best way to answer that.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good question. I think that those kind of roles are dangerous, like all of witchcraft. I don't think that it's easy. It's a role of service. Like if you don't go into it with the idea that you'll be serving your tradition, if you think that it's an aggrandizement, or if you think that it makes you special, there's probably a problem. Like people that I've seen go wrong, and I have had the, we'll call it the dark privilege of observing a number of people who have gone wrong with holding office. It usually comes about from a desire to push themselves above other people. And
Absolutely.
I think this is, like this is a lifting job. It's not a pushing yourself over people job. You want
It's
to fire them.
you want to fire them? Did you say?
No, inspire them.
Oh, okay.
That would be
Sorry.
quite different.
Oh, maybe that's my energy coming in, seeping in there. I don't know. But it is one I'll speak from personal experience here. I've never been the facilitator of that, of a group before like that. I've certainly tried, and I've always failed, and I've learned very valuable lessons from that failing. But I have been in a situation in a spiritual tradition that was African based, of that sense of a community as a familial unit. And I feel like that can often be a very alien thing for particularly Westerners because of that whole concept of Protestantism and that whole idea of individualism and that sense that we're all on our individual spiritual paths, and how dare you, prevent me from experiencing all of this. What have you noticed over the years of your work in community building? Has there been any shifts, any changes, any trends? And how have you reacted to those or responded to those?
It's an interesting question. I feel that the type of witchcraft I practice tends to ask the same thing of people, regardless of what trends there are in the world.
Mm,
So I would say that we're almost slightly trend resistant
I
in
see.
some regards, in the sense that we continue to ask for something that goes beyond individualism, that we continue to ask for people to become adopted into a family that, will hold fast. That being said, around us, there's some interesting trends, I suppose. I feel obviously that the place for gender diverse people has improved remarkably.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's actually really quite positive in a lot of ways, because I think a lot of the poison I've seen rise to the surface in different so-called traditional witchcraft groupings has been very genderal, like very driven by gender.
Mm,
And yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, all the other stuff, the popularity of witchcraft and everything in your sort of your social media world and
mm,
everything, that sort of things hasn't really touched us a lot.
mm.
I suppose we tend to recruit people through friendship, like they're the friend of
Ah,
someone in the group who becomes interested over years, and it takes a really long time to become affiliated with us, I
that
suppose,
makes
because what
sense.
we're talking about is family.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Is there a guiding hand? And of course, I'm not asking about anything oath-bound here, but maybe in a general sense. Do you feel like people gravitate towards you because of something bigger happening?
Hmm, maybe. I
Yeah.
notice that a lot of people that take a sort of a light interest, not necessarily joining a coven,
Mm,
but taking a strong interest in my work, has to do with the fact that people are a little uneasy
mm,
about the way things are in the world. And I think they would like to have established some kind of support network
mm,
with people that can reciprocate services with each other in should things become more difficult.
mm,
I think there's definitely a certain awareness of, environmental issues and
mm.
social issues that leads people to be more interested in leaving behind that individualism and then starting to think about, oh, who would be here for me if the lights went out, sort of thing.
Yes.
Yeah, like that. Those
Yeah.
questions are coming up more for people. And I'm not suggesting that I'm leaning on any post-apocalyptic kind of thing. It's just
Mm,
simply
mhm.
that people mention it more. They're like, oh, I feel like I need like a team.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's interesting. I've been around the pagan community, both here in Ontario, but also online for the past 20 years. And like, funnily enough, every single time I meet another author, it turns out that we probably interacted on some of the big pagan forums back 20 years ago. It's fascinating to kind of reconnect with people in that way. And over the years, I've noticed that there seems to be, I don't want to say trends, but there seems to be, as we age up, as we age out, and as people are writing and as people are talking, there seems to be then a kind of a downward downgrade of experiences. I'm noticing that younger people coming in, teenagers and 20 somethings, are asking and speaking about and working through things that were never on our radar 20 years ago.
Mm. Mm.
And
Yeah,
I'm yeah, no, you know what I mean?
I do.
Hmm.
I like it. I actually
Yeah,
am quite. I mean, I must admit, I don't give a lot of my attention to anything which sort of doesn't take my interest. I don't waste
totally.
my life on TikTok or anything.
Oh yeah.
I mean, no, not saying that the whole thing is a waste, but I haven't quite ventured there. But yeah, I'm enjoying younger people. I'm enjoying the fact that like I have friends in their 20s and 30s who are so much more switched on. And I think maybe there is a good side to some of this internet stuff
Mm,
as well. You know,
hmm.
I think they're getting hold of information faster and
It's
experiences faster.
absolutely. It amazes me. Like my one of my very first witchcraft books was actually Starhawk's book, and I got it from the local. I actually ordered it through, especially through the local bookstore, and I mean that was 20 years ago, and I didn't understand anything that Starhawk was saying in that book. But it seems like people have so much more. I don't even know where I'm going with this topic, Lee. I'll be honest with you. It's just one of those interesting pieces around that idea of community because
Interesting.
I feel like for such a long time, so many of the materials were focused on, independent practice. This is how you do this. This is how you do it independently. And I'm seeing so many other small, like younger people gravitating towards traditions again and towards forming working groups and towards exploring in community. And I do wonder if that's just maybe the pendulum swinging back.
Hmm. It could be. I know
Hmm.
that the groups that I'm aware of in that sort of age bracket here in Australia, I'm really quite impressed by their level of practice and their ability to deal with other people, and
Hmm.
they seem to be a bit ahead of the game.
I can't say anything about Australia because all the people I know from Australia are queer. So it's like I have no idea about the straight people down there and
Oh, that's not true.
but it
No,
is. Sorry, go on.
no, I was just going to say that my witch house has sort of everything and everyone on
Oh,
that
I love
regard. But
it.
outside of that, I would agree with you that
Mm.
a lot of those younger people, but that's statistically true, isn't it? Of that
Mm.
generation, apparently over 30% of Gen Z are queer. So,
I love it. I
crazy.
absolutely love it. So this
Well,
brings
it's
us.
not doing anyone
Sorry, go
any
on.
harm. It's not doing anyone any harm.
It isn't. No, it was certainly
No,
not going through the whole witch craze of the satanic panic of the 1980s. Um,
no.
but it is it's funny with that use of language. Let's talk about that use of language, because I feel like there's a genuine interest in exploring language and creating language and forging language among younger people, the younger generations. I mean, I'm only 37. I'm not like aged, but but I am curious for you. Then I know in some of the other interviews you've done, you've you found it difficult to describe in limited language what you do, your approach, your worldview, and even your writing style is so flowery and wonderfully Shakespearean in many ways, alliterative and full of illusions, I should say. Allusions, not illusions, I should say. Well, yes, illusions too.
It probably was as well.
I'm wondering for you as a writer then, how do you negotiate the limitations of language when it comes to your
Well,
writing?
I've always thought of myself as an artist more than anything else. I would have thought originally that was what I wanted to be when I grew up, so to speak. You know, I wanted to be a writer of fiction. And I guess that's why I shy away from direct questions. I mean, I guess that's why my first book was called A Deed Without a Name. It's not that I don't think you can describe witchcraft. I think you can, but it's poetry. It's not something you could look up in a dictionary and get a decent explanation of what it is. The actual act of it is an art, and I'd rather discuss it artistically than in a nailing down kind of way, because every now and again something surprises me that jumps out of my definitions, and I'm like, no, well, fair enough, that's witchcraft. You know, I'm quite open to what it could mean, because it wasn't our term necessarily. I mean, or at least it hasn't belonged to us for most of its lifespan. It's belonged as an accusatory term. So it's already an interesting little space, isn't it, to consider. I do find language to be difficult, but it's sort of difficult in the sense that it's stimulating, trying to find new ways to twist it around to make it say some crooked sorts of things.
That makes a
But
lot of
yeah,
sense.
for
I love
me,
that.
yeah, I think that's the best way I could put it, is to say that you can talk about witchcraft, but you're probably best to do it if you're an artist of some sort.
I really feel that on a deep level. Some of the spiritual practices I do is in storytelling and that relationship with the people who are listening to the story, and even with that that way of weaving words, and sometimes that it isn't the word necessarily, it's the body language, the other forms of language that accompany it. What is your favorite form of language, Lee? Maybe I can ask you that.
Ah, that's interesting. I mean, I would say that some of that would have shifted a little bit in my post-tumor life, because I would have said words were my favorite initially, and they still are one of my favorite babies. But I think I've started to become a lot more aware of tactile things and color and motion, like movement. And I think a lot of that has to do with losing the sight in my right eye and
Right.
becoming much more dependent on those other senses. I've started to think more about music and about movement and color and like visual art and all those kind of things that, yeah, I think I've definitely broadened out. My favorite languages have become, yeah, much more sensory.
It was an unfair question for me to jump on you because that's such a huge question sometimes. But it is curious for me because even before your tumor, like the way that you expressed, even with words, they evoke so many visuals. It's a story that people are entering with your work. It isn't now we're going to light the candles and we're going to say this and that. I mean, if you have written like that, I haven't come across it yet, but
No, I haven't.
what was the
I
biggest? Oh, sorry, go on.
No, please.
Well,
You go.
This is the trouble, folks, of not like looking at each other. We can't like, especially with online.
Yeah, that's true.
We can't. We constantly talking each other. With the tumor piece, that was such a it was such a moment in your life, and something that has been a part of your life for quite a few years now. Can I ask you how your craft changed afterwards?
Radically. It's been growing in there for possibly up to a decade, which has been filled with a lot of health complaints as well that I had to sort of work around. But at the same time, you don't want to say that it's all been worth it or anything like that. But in a way, it's sort of almost has, because my brain had to perform, because my work requires my brain. And as that tumor was getting bigger, it eventually reached the size of a tennis ball inside my head. My brain had to reconfigure around that obstacle. And I was still reading academic texts and writing at a relatively high level, although I was losing the ability to do the human part of workshops. The actual interacting with people part was becoming harder. I can see that in retrospect. But after it's been gone, as my brain sort of settled back in, I'm noticing that my whole way of experiencing the other world has shifted in accordance with my fetch becoming more powerful. And I don't know whether that is simply because it has to take up for the fact that I'm a bit blind in one side, or whether it is something just, maybe this is part of my journey. I mean, everybody goes through repeated initiations during life, and I feel that maybe this was one of them for me that has greatly broadened out my sorceress practice. I would say that I see things differently with my otherworldly senses. I don't quite know how to describe that though, unfortunately.
I wouldn't even disrespect you by expecting you to. I feel you on that. I can't remember where I had read it, but as I was reading, you talk about that in another interview or on another podcast somewhere. Maybe it was in your book or one of your books. I couldn't help but see the almost similarity to that sense of Odin, right? Like giving up of the eye, even though it wasn't chosen. I'm curious then, is there anything that you is there anything that you wish you could have told yourself before you started to really experience the symptoms of this tumor, to prepare yourself?
I suppose the only one would be that I wouldn't lose my ability to think, because that was on the table as a risk factor before surgery, that I might wake up with greatly limited mental capacities, and that was probably the most afraid I've ever been of anything in my life, to be honest with you. I was very confronted by that notion of how much of my self-identity and my individualism I'd hung on this idea that I was intelligent, or that I was, gifted in some capacity, and the idea that that could just be taken away from me and I might come out needing people to feed me with a spoon, which there's no shame in that. And I think I'd like to have known that too. I would have liked to have known that my whole worth as a human being doesn't hang on my intellect. But at the same time, I might have liked to have known I wouldn't lose it too. That would have been nice. But also, I think that's a humbling thing that is initiatory, that realization that even if I had lost those capacities, that I would still be a being of worth. That's important too.
It's really important. I hear you on that. My dad, I guess the reason I'm really trying to not be disrespectful with these questions, my dad had a series of strokes about 7 years ago, and his personality changed, and he now becomes very frustrated because he can't do some of the things that he could do back then. And they were mild strokes, but that sense of frustration and holding space for that sense of frustration is a real big part of his journey. I'm curious for you. I guess I hope this isn't a disrespectful question, Lee, but
not at all.
What grace do you offer yourself as you relate to yourself now versus the Lee of 10 years ago or more?
What grace do I offer myself 10 years ago or myself now, do you mean?
Is that, yes, I think that's what I mean.
Or both. I offer a lot of grace to myself 10 years ago, that's for sure. When I think about the things that I did wrong in terms of like, social things, or even towards the end, I slightly pranged our car because my ability to judge distance was disappearing as my sight went. I was very angry at myself for making that mistake after being a driver for many years. So yes, I do offer quite a bit of grace to myself, but also specifically to myself now, because I've been through an enormous ordeal and I can understand a lot of things about the way that going through an ordeal does give you access to greater wisdom, and I suppose also compassion for people that don't come out the other end as well as I did, I suppose. But also, when I don't necessarily do something perfectly, I forgive myself a lot more readily.
Yes.
That's for sure.
Right. It's funny, what you just said was something very similar to what Ramdas had said about his stroke and reacquainting himself with his body and realigning his vision of himself going forward. How I was gonna ask a silly question and be like, so how do you teach now? No, I guess I'm finding it difficult to. I guess I'm finding it difficult to find the words of the question I really want to ask, which is, how has it affected kind of how you approach your relationship with community? How did it affect how you approach your relationship with your own craft going forward? What is going forward looking like for you now? I guess I hope that came out in a really horribly jumbled form, but I hope that question came out.
I feel like I understand what you're trying to ask me. I feel a lot redder in the sense that I have more community feeling. I have more sense of ability to people. I used to struggle with phone calls or even Zoom meetings and stuff because I found it incredibly hard to socially guess what the person wanted or what their facial expression was trying to tell me or something. And that continues to be the case, but I guess I just lean into it now. I sort of accept that I'm a strange little guy, and it's kind of a part of the marginality of being a witch, to be a strange little person of whatever type, isn't it? I sort of accept that about myself, and I am really enjoying community now. I actually don't mind a phone call. I certainly quite like a Zoom call where I can see the person. It's great. But yeah, I do. I feel warmer. I feel that I've become a warmer, more communal person for sure, and I'm looking forward to developing our community more.
That's what I wanted to get to. That's exactly what I was haphazardly kind of tripping all over to get to. I feel like so many people, at least the people who I'm connecting with because of my work, they find themselves in places of that transformation, that places of moving forward, and leaving behind who they thought they were, who people thought they were in their lives, and finding that they're letting go of all those pieces. I found that in myself. Like I remember when I first reached out to you, and this was a continual thing in many areas of my life. I would take things so personally, and I would take things so I was very insecure, noticing that as I'm moving into this forward movement in my life, so many of those insecurities and those pieces, as I embrace this, my own version of a strange little guy, are dropping away. But I feel like that's that part of that cannibalism piece, to bring in the people of the outside. It's stepping into that taboo of letting go.
Very much so. And I think it comes back to that grace that you were talking about before, of forgiving yourself for being strange. And when I mess something up, I forgive myself for being strange. And I expect other people to do so too, because what did they come here for if they didn't expect that I would be strange?
Right.
You know, like, and I think a lot of what we're hiding during that process of, like, you know, being over conscious of whether or not we might have come across wrong, or did we offend someone, or did we not keep our end of the social deal correctly or something, is all about trying to mask and trying to normalize ourselves in some way. But are we actually meant to be normal, or are we actually or are we actually magical practitioners of one of the strangest and most unusual forms of magic that exists? I kind of think the latter.
Yeah, it's an interesting. It's an invitation, isn't it? That question. It really is an invitation. That question. I love that. I love that. Lee, I could talk to you for ages and ages and ages, and I feel like I would be stumbling over my words. But unfortunately, we're coming to a close. But I wanted to thank you so much for meeting with me. This was wonderful.
Oh, you're most welcome, and I've really enjoyed it, Ben. Thank you.
I'm hoping that I can head down south at some point and come and see all of the Australian community, and come and maybe have a cup of tea or coffee with you down there. I would really love that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you would always be welcome.
Thank you. So with that being said, then, as a strange little guy in the woods, where can people find you, and what do you have? This is coming out in the middle of December. Do you have anything in person or any online events that people can come and join?
My Patreon, I'm developing a little shop there where I'm starting to make videos that do the material that I do in my in-person workshops, just because Australia has such a small population. So that's one thing. My website will also guide you to where you can purchase my books, and I'm republishing a lot of stuff that I wrote, like my fiction that I wrote during my tumour,
Oh,
through
that's
Rebel
exciting.
Satori. Yeah, so
Nice.
there's going to be a whole lot of coming out, really. Those would be the main places that you could find me.
Wonderful. I will make sure that so it's leemorganbooks.com. I'll also place the Patreon link in the chat below, in the not the chat below, in the show notes. And again, if people are interested in entering into your work, because I haphazardly, like, I think A Deed Without a Name was the first one, and then your second one, The People of the Outside, was the second one I read. What would you suggest is a good first work of yours to enter into your work, Lee? What would you suggest people who may not necessarily know your work?
To be honest with you, I think my work makes up a kind of Celtic knotwork. I don't think there is a right place to enter. I think you could jump into any of it, and it's all connected to everything else. I suppose A Deed Without a Name is probably the most straightforward place to jump in, but it depends what you're looking for. I mean, some people come the other direction. They find my fiction first and then my nonfiction. So I'd really kind of just say go where you're led. There is a faerie book. There is a book, Standing and Not Falling, which is my most compassionate book that is there to help people. I would say just jump in.
Just jump in. Okay.
Just jump in.
For those of you in Britain, then, just like Coronation Street, just jump in. Those of you in Australia or who know of Australian television, it's like Neighbours, just jump in, right? Perfect. Thank you so much, Lee. This has been an absolute delight, and I look forward to having you on again.
I look forward to it too. Take care, Ben.
You too. You have a good rest of the day over there in the future, because it is daytime over there and it's nighttime here. You have a wonderful rest of the day, Lee.